This is a difficult and awkward discussion inside the Trump circle, this birthday. I know of one situation in which this was brought up, how to kind of counter program against this. Trump completely cut that off, cut this person dead. No discussion of this, no wanting to go down that path. He now deflects to the 250th birthday of the United States. That's the birthday that counts. That's the birthday they should be thinking about. Anything not to have people thinking about his 80th birthday.
Michael.
Joanna.
So this is a special birthday issue of Donald Trump.
Not our birthday.
No, not our birthday, though it is our 125th episode. We started less than a year ago tracking Donald Trump and his presidency, and we thought it would be a good thing to do on the eve of his 80th birthday, as the president enters his 9th decade, to reflect on how we got from there to here. And in honor of his birthday, I am wearing a t-shirt with gold on it. I just would like to point that out, since the Oval Office is now smothered in gold and there are gold statues in DC.
And it's not just how we got from there to here, but more extraordinary how he got from there, from his, an outer borough Queens real estate developer, to here, the president of the United States, the most not just the most important person in the world, something that I'm not sure he was ever interested in, but the most famous person in the world, which is what he was interested in. And it may be, at this point, the most famous person who ever lived.
Wow. The most famous person who ever lived, which of course is his dream. And he's recently been reflecting, and we can talk about this as we talk about his legacy, perhaps towards the end of the podcast. You know, he's been comparing himself with Napoleon and great figures
Reflecting is an odd word to use.
All right. He hasn't been
Trump context.
Okay, because he doesn't reflect.
He may be the most famous person in the world, but he also may be the least reflective person in the world.
Right. Well, he certainly thinks he's more famous than Jesus, more famous than Napoleon.
Well, he clearly is more famous than all of those people. I mean, I genuinely believe that that the measure here would be, and obviously with vastly greater communications, vastly all of that does give him an advantage. But even with that advantage, he is more famous than any American president, arguably always the most famous person in the world, has ever been. That is his skill, his accomplishment, to get inside people's head, to be the only person, anybody, to crowd out everything and everybody else.
Right. So he's achieved his life dream. Well, where do we begin, Michael? Do we begin with him in Queens as a child? And before we begin, of course, I have to remind everybody, please press the subscription button. We're trying to get to 700,000 subscribers in the next couple of weeks, if we can do it with your help. But we're planning to cover all of it in this episode.
I would begin in the 1980s, because that is the moment that Trump is made, the Trump that we know. And it's important to understand that that the 1980s were actually the break. The world cleaved at that point, especially in New York. The broke and bohemian city became this new city of avarice. I mean, everything was remade in the reflection of money in the 1980s. And I think we think of New York as that now, but it wasn't before. It was a city of intellectuals. Well, it was a city of crime and crack, but it was also a city of intellectuals, of the theater, of one of the largest industries in New York was the book public, or most, at least one of the most influential was the book publishing industry, the magazine industry. It was, to be a rich person. There were lots of rich people, but they weren't that rich, and their status was equivocal. You had a much probably higher status if you were a book person or an intellectual or a theater person in New York City. Money was a peripheral attainment. And then the 1980s came, Ronald Reagan, deregulation, new financial instruments, and suddenly it was the city of people making more money than one had ever imagined could be made. It was the city of all kinds of figures in the financial industry, and it became the city of figures like Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein, and it was really a moment that recreated the culture as we know it. And Donald Trump became the one of the avatars of this.
Right, and perhaps it was best reflected in popular culture by the movie Wall Street, which elevated New York once more to a sort of sexy city where famously the line "greed is good" came from.
Yeah, well, I think there are a lot of things. Bonfire of the Vanities, obviously a terrific account of that period. But again, and it was that period, this new moment out of which the figure of Donald Trump came, and the operation of it, that money was available, debt was available to anybody who kind of pretended that they were worthy of debt. I don't know how any way to put it. These are people who, in ordinary times, banks would not have supported. People would not have lent money to, but they lent money to Donald Trump because he was Donald Trump, because he was this braggart, because he managed to get his picture in the newspaper constantly. He sort of commandeered Page Six, the New York Post gossip columns, where he became a regular feature, and he was able to raise money against this image, the image of Donald Trump, and he came to understand this. The more famous you got, the more money you would have access to. So put his name on buildings in as big letters as possible. So he became this real estate developer, but not just a real estate developer. He made investments. He became the guy in Atlantic City who a casino magnate in Atlantic City. Just let me point out the vote that I am most proud of in my life was cast when I was I think just eight. It may have been one of my first votes when I lived in New Jersey, where I grew up and was still voting. I voted against gambling in Atlantic City. That was a failed vote, but for me, it remains a proud vote.
You're eating French fries at the beach and you want to take a quick dip in the ocean, so you put a seagull on watch. That's not security, that's catering for the seagull. There's a reason you wouldn't trust a seagull with your fries, just like there's a reason why Morgan & Morgan is America's largest injury law firm. Morgan & Morgan has a proven track record of fighting for the people. For over 35 years, with over $30 billion recovered for their clients, Morgan & Morgan knows a thing or two about fighting to get you the compensation you deserve. Hiring Morgan & Morgan is like hiring an army to go into battle. They've got more than 1,000 lawyers and 100 offices nationwide. If you're injured by someone else's negligence, you deserve to be paid. Not all law firms are the same. Hire the wrong one and you may be beat before you even start. If you're ever injured, you should check out Morgan & Morgan. Morgan & Morgan will fight to get their clients the best results, and their fee is free unless they win. For more information, you can go to forthepeople.com/Trump. Can I just point out here that so much of this especially as regarding Donald Trump, was built on smoke and mirrors. So you refer to the fact that he was constantly in page six. Well, one of the reasons he was constantly in page six was because he himself was pretending to be his own publicist in the name of John Barron and calling the New York Post with stories about himself, which was one way to get yourself out there. But it wasn't as if other people were calling up with stories and saying, oh, Donald Trump, it's absolutely marvelous. You must write about him. He's an incredible guy. This was all self-fueled from his inner engine, craving attention and
Well,
craving publicity.
I would push back on that.
Of course you
Actually,
would. Of course you
you
would.
know, he became, and I remember, I mean, Rupert Murdoch and I spent an amount of time talking about this because he hated Trump. I mean, he thought Trump stood for nothing. But more importantly, he thought he was a great tabloid figure, which Trump turned himself into. So page six became, there was a symbiotic relationship there. Page six wanted to promote Donald Trump because he was good copy.
Right. And he
The
was good for business, good for business.
Totally. So being good copy was one of the things that Trump understood. But so it wasn't, so I mean the empire, so the Trump empire as we know it sort of came together in the 1960s and then would progressively come apart. But it was, involved buildings in New York, involved Atlantic City. In 1985, he bought Mar-a-Lago, and that was one of those deals. All of this had the vague, corruption was never very far from this. He also bought an airline, the shuttle between Washington and New York and Washington and New York and Boston. He bought that, and it almost immediately, by the first debt payment, went into bankruptcy. And then and I think this is 1980, 87 or 88, he publishes this book, The Art of the Deal, which is the thing that really makes him suddenly a national figure, because the book goes gangbusters. And again, this is related to the 1980s. This is a zeitgeist moment. The 1980s suddenly is everybody thinks that money is easy. Everybody thinks that all you have to do to get rich is do a deal. Trump was exactly on top of that, that cultural moment, and he became hugely famous through this.
Right. I remember when I moved here as the bureau chief for The Guardian, for the first year, all anyone would do from the news desk is call me and say, can you get an interview with Donald Trump? Can you get an interview with Donald Trump? Because he represented in the UK the epitome of the American businessman who had opinions about everything. And as you said, gave good quote, understood what you needed to do to be at the center of a story, to be on the front page of a tabloid, to dominate the gossip column, page six, and it was the era of junk bonds, and everything seemed, to your point about deregulation, everything seemed possible. And looking from the UK, where I was observing this as a journalist for the Guardian newspaper then and for the BBC, everything seemed so exciting. It all seemed bigger, the stakes were higher, and you had these flamboyant characters. And of course, no one could be more flamboyant than Donald Trump.
And of course, the price of flamboyance was bankruptcy, which then, as soon as the 1990s came, this is actually incredible, because obviously the price of flamboyance is bankruptcy, and yet the price of bankruptcy turned out not to be failure and humiliation. But at any rate, the 1990s come. Everybody, he goes into a debt crisis. His real estate is in debt. Atlantic City is in debt. He can't support Mar-a-Lago, so he has to turn it into a country club. The airline has to be sold. The Plaza Hotel. It's a catastrophe. But the interesting thing is that he recovers from this. And so you have one of those glaring examples, one of those confounding examples of the power of brand.
Well, the power of brand and also using bankruptcy and the rebouncing from bankruptcy is a sign of resilience. I mean, Rupert Murdoch did it too, right? He was on the cusp of bankruptcy at one point.
Well, yes, but Rupert Murdoch was on the, I mean, actually went hat in hand to the banks, managed to hold his empire together, and then rebuild it. Trump never really did that.
No, he just moved on to next things.
He just kind of sort of cast aside the business itself, understood the power of brand, and then from there just exploited that. There was no business after that. Effectively, there was no Trump business. There was just Trump, the brand, who became a licensing organization. And that was a part of this incredible denial, which obviously still goes on. Pay no attention to all of these bankrupt businesses that that I represent and that I bankrupted. Pay no attention to that. I am Donald Trump. I am the author of The Art of the Deal. I am Donald Trump. I am Donald Trump. Repeated and repeated, repeated endlessly. And look at all of these, and this then became part of the brand. Look at all of these models who are on my arms. And then there were these beauty pageants and all in all of this. So somehow the piece of DNA which almost all of us have, which is our tells us that we have been shamed and humiliated, and we must go hide in a corner, and the best we might do in life is to do good works and hope that someone forgives us. It doesn't occur in Donald Trump. He just goes on. I am Donald Trump. Just remarkable.
I'm going to repeat it too. The idea that bankruptcy somehow demonstrate that he is resilient, that he keeps going. And to your point, he didn't keep going in business. He just kept going on in the business of being Donald Trump.
And it didn't bother him that he became, well, not just a character, but a caricature. He was, so I mean, I used to see Trump in the 80s. Almost, it seemed like any time you went out at night, there would be Donald Trump, just kind of a shark moving through the crowds, always with a couple of sort of henchmen behind him, or wingmen, or whatever you want to call them. Probably one of them was Jeffrey Epstein at the time. And you would just kind of stand back and look at this guy. And then I had never met him then. You just knew who he was. But when I was at New York Magazine in the later 90s, he used to start to call me up because I was the guy writing about media. So he kind of made that connection. And he would call me, and he would call me. It was really, a lot of people would call and complain about whatever the magazine had said about them, but he would reliably call to complain when he wasn't mentioned by the magazine.
Just as a quick aside, when people called to complain about you writing about them or what you'd said about them, how did you deflect?
I just usually just listen and go, thanks, I understand. You actually try not to engage because they're just going to yell at you. And with Trump, that's the way I would do it too. First thing, there was no alternative because he didn't give you a moment to speak. It would just be Donald Trump motor mouthing at you. And he was never, there was never a hostility. It was always vaguely amusing, digressive always. He would try to offer you stories. So gossip that he knew, you ought to be writing about so and so who's a terrible person. And then you could kind of dine out on that. It was an interesting phone call to get. And but always this promotion, always. You began to think of him. Doesn't the guy ever sleep? Doesn't the guy ever, how could you be so shameless as to call up magazines and demand promotion, demand publicity? Um, but that was Donald Trump, very much Donald Trump. He was I will do anything to become the center of attention, to take the stage. Now, as a result of that, he became, of course, ridiculous. And there was a point in the late 90s when Peter Kaplan, who was running the New York Observer at the time, one of the kind of arbiters of who was up and who was down in the city power structure. And then Peter declared that nobody could write about Donald Trump anymore. Donald Trump was a cliche of power. Forget him. And I think that actually kind of became the conventional wisdom about Donald Trump. He was a joke and he was finished, and nobody should take him seriously in any way, shape, or form.
How ironic, given that Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, ended up buying the New York Observer.
Yeah. Nope. Many ironies, and many in the small fishbowl of New York City. This is a cross. So many axes cross at so many points, and now the axis that crosses is, of course, the Apprentice years, which reinvent Donald Trump.
But before we get on to the Apprentice years, can we just have one moment on the art of the deal? Because the author who wrote it with him, is it Tony Schwartz?
Tony Schwartz,
Tony
an
Schwartz,
old friend of mine. We used to work together. Sure.
right, has said that he regrets writing the book now. But I think what's fascinating about the book, in as much as it's sort of America's self-help of how to become a millionaire, how to become rich from a man that's constantly teetering on the edge of bankruptcy at the time that the book is being written. It is his cynicism, is Donald Trump's cynicism. What becomes clear in the publication of that book is Donald Trump's cynicism about the gullibility of Americans, that they will pay him for advice.
Totally, but this is a complicated thing because remember, Donald Trump didn't write this book, and Donald Trump didn't read this book. So,
Right.
so
But he did
it
promote the
is.
book. He did
Yes.
promote the
Oh,
book, and he
very
slapped
much.
his
But
name on
so
it.
it's a reflection of the reflection of Donald Trump. He had made himself into this character, and then Tony Schwartz could translate this character into a book written by Donald Trump that was not written by Donald Trump. So the levels, the mirrors of irreality in the entire Trump story are kind of constant, and the book is a pretty good reflection of this.
But but uh, uh, but at some point, and perhaps Trump doesn't realize the irony of it, but at some point there is the thread there that continues through his uh, his presidential campaign and his presidency, that Americans are gullible, that they will buy anything, that when he tries to help himself in the way that he has done in this presidency, which so far seems to have netted him around $4 billion, he openly says people don't care. He said, I could stand on Fifth Avenue, shoot someone, people don't care. This sense that he is such an emblem of success to people that they don't care about the chaos around it.
Yeah, it's success too, but it's also in the performance that the people are engaged in this story.
Right.
They're kind of a lot of people on his side. He's the hero of this story. He's the guy who shouldn't have succeeded, who does succeed. He's the guy who manages to hold our attention. Everybody else, remember, I mean, this is
Right, right. Such
a
an
kind of
important point.
main cultural a fact of our times that no, you can't hold people's attention. Everybody falls by the wayside. Everybody becomes yesterday's news, except only one person who doesn't.
I know
And
it's
it's Donald
astonishing
Trump.
how I know, and just at the point where you think, oh, he's going to disappear as a failed New York businessman who once overreached, he is remade by the British producer Mark Burnett in the Apprentice years.
Okay, before then, let's get on to that because that's pivotal. But as a preface to this,
Hmm.
so there's a restaurant in New York where a lot of media people and business people went for lunch for many years. They still go. It's a place called Michael's. It's on West 55th Street, and it's a place where I went often. And
Michael, you had a regular table. It was table number 5. Whenever I met you at Michael's, it was always the same table. It was against the wall where you were able to see the entire room, and the entire
exactly.
room could see you and who you were eating lunch with. Because that's the point of Michael's. There were power tables. It's like a kind of the Kremlinology of understanding Michael's, especially on a Wednesday when people went there for lunch. It was once a weekly column, I want to say, in the Observer, that they would actually track who was going there. Anyway, you were always there at table number 5.
And so at any rate, at the table, so I was having lunch with somebody, and at the table right next to our table was Donald Trump, who was having lunch with somebody. And, so only a half a arm away. And because everybody knows everybody at Michael's, there was a lot of cross table talking. Um, and at any rate, when the person I was with, we were sort of talking to Trump and who he was with, but at that point, a a successful producer of reality television, let me not say who this was, and but uh, comes up to us and in speaking to both tables and says, just a kind of high, backslapping kind of thing, and and somebody says, I mean, geez, how you doing? You just had a great success and amazing. Everybody was always complimenting everyone about how amazing they were at Michael's. Um, and then they would leave and say terrible things about them, of course. But
It was a bit like an office canteen for the media, I think it's fair to say. Everybody knew
exactly.
everybody.
And then this producer of reality television pauses when there's somebody says, how is it going? And this isn't great what you've done. He says, this person leans forward and says, you have no idea how much pussy I'm getting. At which point, Donald Trump says, how much? So
That was
that's
that was why you went to Michael's. That was why you went to Michael's.
But then, within a very short time, of course, Donald Trump would be approached to do this reality television show, and it's important, I think, to acknowledge that a whole list of other more successful and prominent businessmen were approached before Donald Trump, and they turned this down. Donald Trump, however, accepted this idea that he would play the consummate businessman on this show, The Apprentice, and I guess history has changed on that decision.
Well, and there are so many interesting tells, even in that first episode of The Apprentice, which I went back to watch. I mean, there's a fascinating. First of all, it's sort of premised on just a lie, which is that it starts with Donald Trump going, I'm the biggest developer, I'm the biggest real estate developer in New York City. And he's flying around in a helicopter. And then, of course, he's shot in a huge stretch limo, which nobody rides around with in New York. But of course, it's very, very telegenic. And of course, he's not the biggest real estate developer. He takes you into Trump Tower, which they end up using as a studio in effect, because they haven't been able to find the right thing. And he goes, "Well, I've actually got an empty floor of the Trump Tower. You can shoot it there." And the producers talk about the fact that when they actually went into the Trump offices, the desks were kind of battered. They had to rent furniture to create this idea of Trump as a very successful businessman. And in one of the, I don't think it's the first episode, although you do see an image of the Taj Mahal casino, which is one of the casinos he owns in Atlantic City, and it says the Donald Trump Taj Mahal. Actually, by the end of the first season, it's in bankruptcy. So this incredible disconnect, the cognitive dissonance between him playing a fantastically successful guy on television who appears to make decisions very quickly and in the moment and instinctively and as if he's got years of business success, which in fact you realize is just a massively smart editing job, because as you have talked about, they would film him for hours because a lot of what he said didn't really make sense. And then every now and then there'd be moments of clarity, which they would zoom into.
It's just important to keep in mind here that he comes to this television show when he's finished in New York.
Right.
New York is his stage. New York is his town. New York is where he's succeeded. New York is his life, and it rejects him, kind of ignominiously. So this is the point in which he uses television to find an altogether new market for himself.
And we should also point out that at the same time as there's been a financial revolution, there's been a revolution in television with the arrival of reality television. And who is the dominant producer here? It's Mark Burnett. He's a British producer who's showed up in Hollywood. He's done Survivor. He makes The Apprentice. He goes on to change the landscape of primetime television. And we exit the first episode of The Apprentice. Trump has fired someone. There's no money at stake here. What's at stake for the winner of The Apprentice is a job in the Donald Trump organization, which, of course, these people are desperate to get. And it remakes Donald Trump.
And just to point out here that there really is no Trump organization. I mean, the Trump organization is essentially a little family holding company, administering the licenses to all of these buildings which have the name Trump on, which they don't own. It's just the Trump name that has been licensed to this, and they do a little hotel management, but they really own very little. And it is just they're a small-time hospitality organization, basically.
Well, New York has rejected Trump, but the rest of America falls upon him as if he is the new American Idol.
No, and really, I mean, remember, The Apprentice becomes the #1 show. And for the next 14 years, I mean, it's from a political standpoint, it's almost incomprehensible that for 14 years he's the star of a top-rated reality television show in an American culture that is crazy for reality television.
And crazy for success, crazy for stories of success, the kind of Willy Loman, the hustle. And Donald Trump plays this helicopter flying limo passenger with all the status symbols of success.
Well, just to point out that Willy Loman was the opposite of that.
Well, no, I know.
Willy Loman was the failure.
Well, I know, but what I'm suggesting is that there was a part of Trump that was a Willy Loman character that was frantically paddling under the surface to keep the illusion of success. And then along comes a television show which actually makes him into a success. Willy Loman never got that opportunity.
Well, I want to refine this of somewhat, because Willy Loman is a person who is suffering all of the time, whose failure is he has imbibed his own failure.
Yes, okay, fair enough. Trump has not done that.
Trump is another character. He's Sammy Glick. He has no moral center, no sense of shame, no sense of failure, no even understanding of when he has failed. He just keeps going, and that's the remarkable thing about this guy. Nothing, all of the things that would have felled any other normal human being just roll off of him.
Well, and certainly would have felled any politician. Right? Any politician would have been felled by what happened to him. But he has a remarkable ability to just to keep going, and to understand the power of attention.
And then to understand, I mean, actually, so one of the things that happens, and we'll get to this, is that as the show starts to fade, and it takes a long time to fade. I mean, this is The Apprentice is extraordinary television.
And we should
But
just, and again, reminding people of television at the time, it was, this was before YouTube, it was before Netflix. He had 20 million viewers for the first episode, 20 million viewers. And though, as you point out, the show faded, it was over 14 seasons and it dominated the ratings, as he knew, because he was obsessed by the ratings.
like absolutely obsessed. Always knew the ratings. But so he's at this point. It's another inflection point. He's looking at ignominy. What happens to television stars after their television shows get canceled? Ignominy. You're the worst thing, because
Ignominy or ignominy? I've never heard it pronounced as ignominy. Is that the American pronunciation of
well,
it?
it's the New Jersey pronunciation.
I've never heard it said like that, but I like it.
But at any rate, and it's true for all people who get pushed out off of television. Their lives have been so accustomed to being in the public mind. When they're not in that anymore, they die. Actually, I mean, their actual death will might be years off, but they have in their own sense of self died.
Well,
So
and
Trump,
can I just remind people as well that Trump at this point, or at least for most of The Apprentice, was incredibly highly paid, very well fluffed talent. So, when you're that successful in a television show, and when the television show revolves around you, which it very much did, because he understood what role he had to play on the show, you get treated incredibly well. You have all your needs met. And then there is the moment, as you say, of ignominy, where it fades and the next day you are nobody. And he must have been very afraid of that.
yeah, no, and also just also an important note, when Trump begins The Apprentice, he's pretty much broke. And it's The Apprentice that gives him an amount of financial security, which he has not had up until this point. But anyway, during The Apprentice, one of the ways he promotes The Apprentice is by announcing that he's going to run for president. And this begins in, I think 2008 in a serious fashion. Remember, in 2008, he picks up the the Obama birth certificate thing. He becomes the premier birther. But he's using this not so much out of an interest in politics, but in order to promote The Apprentice. So, but then we get to 2014, when the Apprentice really starts to look like it's that it is within a short period of time going to go the way of all television. And then he starts up again in order to promote The Apprentice, to say he's going to run for president. And somehow, against the specter of The Apprentice getting canceled, and somehow in his own mind, in understanding that running for president is the great promotional opportunity for anyone. I mean, the ultimate promotional opportunity, that becomes a reality. I am going to run for president, and it starts in 2014, and then in 2015 he actually announces.
And he comes down the gold escalator at Trump Tower with Melania in a way that he has done in the show. The gold escalator in the show is very much a visual tool that they use.
This is the moment he is doing this, and he's doing this with an understanding that this is all about promoting the Trump brand. He never once thinks he is going to become the president of the United States. This is it's just what he has always done. How do you? What is the next step in promoting the name Donald Trump?
Well, and we should remind people that the Republican Party also thought he was a joke and also thought he was doing this to promote his brand, didn't take him seriously. This was still the party of Jeff Flake, of Mitt Romney, of, moderate Republicans.
Of Jeb Bush, who was the leader in the going into 2016. I mean the 2014, 2015 front runner was Jeb Bush.
Was
There was no
low energy Jeb, who was quickly
no
dispatched
question.
by Donald Trump. And of course, on the fringes was the Tea Party that had really come up and been, given more oxygen by the choice of Sarah Palin as John McCain's vice president. So you were aware that there was this sort of right wing of the party that was coming from. It was coming from sort of rural areas, but it was still very much on the margins.
Yes, and there was still the reasonable assumption that Sarah Palin was a death knell of that. I mean, she basically brought down John McCain, or certainly did nothing to help the campaign, and she stood as that figure. Okay, this is all that this represents the weakness of the right wing in America.
Right.
So, and in fact, so Trump comes along, and there is a moment, and it's I think the telling moment and the historical hinge probably is the first Republican debate in the summer of 2015, in which you have I can't, like 12 Republicans on the stage, and these debates, the first debate very early in the season, television debate, usually get an audience of, at best a couple of million people. This debate feature with Donald Trump in it draws an audience of 25 million people. I mean, it's unheard of in politics. I mean, and it should have been the moment in which people said, okay, there's something. I mean, something has happened here. Now, of course, this was read as just Donald Trump is an entertaining figure. Donald Trump is just a ridiculous figure. Donald Trump is a novelty, and that's what this is all about. And it may well have been that's what this is all about, but that turned out also to be a politically powerful message, a politically powerful persona.
Well, and we should remind people that one of the things that people like about Donald Trump is he doesn't behave as a politician. And the moment we understood that was that very first debate, when he came up with nicknames for people, when he didn't seem to care, when clearly, when you watch it now, or you watch clips of it now, and it's interesting to go back and see, he's like, I mean, the attention all goes to him, and everybody else standing around him just shrinks in his presence.
No, there's a moment in that debate when there's just the pro forma question that's always asked, blah blah blah. You want to shoot yourself. They say, will you support whoever is the nominee of your party? And everybody goes, oh yeah, down the
Right,
road.
of course they do. Yeah,
and then they get to Donald Trump, and he pauses, and he says, I don't know, no. I mean, and it's suddenly like, yes, my God, here is a person who is somehow distinguished from all of these other clowns.
Right. Okay, so
moving on, there's another there's I mean, to me, this is another point, another tell everything point. In the spring of 2016, I do my first interview with Donald Trump in his political career phase.
And I remember you calling me and saying, you're never going to guess what I'm about to do. You were in Hollywood. You were off to see him in his house. And you were also laughing about it, but also understanding that this was a moment and that, this could be pretty interesting.
I thought he was a great character. And also, I have always, always, certain was liked him, was amused by him. I had certainly no animosity toward Donald Trump, and you could sit around with him, and he would say these things that nobody else would say, and what's not to like? And a ridiculous figure, but not a hostile figure. So anyway, we sat around in his house in Beverly Hills, and who even knew he had a house in Beverly Hills, filled with all this kind of cast-off hotel furniture, and I was there sitting in his living room, with and Jared Kushner was there, and well, we're just talking. Eventually, I get to the question, which is again a pro forma question of all politicians, and I said, okay, tell me, why do you want to be president? And all politicians flub this question or hesitate or go kind of a cotton mouth.
Well, Ted Kennedy perhaps being the most famous example.
Yeah, and nobody. I mean, the real reason they want to be president is because of their own, to satisfy their own egos, really. Anyway,
Vanity,
Trump.
hubris.
Anyway, he doesn't falter at all on the answer to this. I asked the question, why do you want to be the president? And he says, quote, to be the most famous man in the world. So it is very clear to him. There's no pretense otherwise. This is it. And then
And
at
also
that point,
the irony of he's sitting there in his mansion in Beverly Hills in Hollywood, in the land of the Imagineers. And one of the things that he says in The Apprentice, where he's always giving out his sort of lessons, his homilies to these, kids who are hoping to make it big, is his whole thing is think big. You always have to think bigger. Just keep thinking bigger.
and then having said that, having provided that answer, then at that moment he snaps his fingers and says, Jared, how famous am I? And Jared says, very famous, sir.
That is a great scene for the movie. In fact, I think there's only been one movie, which was the movie called The Apprentice, which was about Trump's apprenticeship to Roy Cohn, one of his mentors, and that was dogged with legal issues. I mean, incredibly
Yeah,
difficult.
no, and they found it hard to get a
distribution.
distributor. Yeah,
Yeah.
no. So, and
And did Jared say it with a sense of irony at that point? I know he was going to go on and be his campaign manager, but no.
Zero irony. No, he said it as a son, and I have sons-in-law, and sons-in-laws kind of move around in a very tactical way.
I cannot imagine your son-in-laws. I mean, poor son-in-laws having to come and meet you.
They're very nice. I mean, believe me, I'm lucky to have the sons-in-law I have, but I am a father-in-law. They are the sons-in-law, and Jared is in that role, very tactically and tactfully moving around his father-in-law and responding to him in a strategic, always, I think, in a highly strategic way. And so this was, yes, to say, there was only one answer to say, yes, you are very, very famous.
And of course, the beginning of your book, Fire and Fury, starts with Trump incredulous that he has won. He's taking a call from Rupert Murdoch. Melania is crying because she didn't want him to win. And then the rest is an almost unimaginable history.
I mean, it's incredible to realize, and I think people find it difficult to realize, if not impossible at this point, that there was no hope, no possibility in the Trump mind that he was going to become the president of the United States. And he would tell people that he won he was winning. It didn't matter the outcome of this. He was won. He comes out of this having gained an enormous amount. He is significantly closer to his goal of becoming the most famous man in the world. Actually, he may have reached this goal through the campaign. but within the campaign itself, no sense that this was ever going to work. That, and in fact, frankly, no sense that it should work. And then remember, along the way, there's the grab them by the pussy, in which the Republican part the Republican National Committee comes and says, we need you really have to withdraw here. And this is really just a month before the election itself. So there is no sense, no hope, no possibility that this is going to happen. And then, of course, it happens.
Well, we spend 3 episodes a week delving into what's going on and the whole presidency of it all. But given that this is his birthday weekend, he's going into his 9th decade. He will be the oldest president by the end of his presidency. What do you think what's inside his head at this point as he celebrates America's 250th anniversary? And do you think he thinks about legacy?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I mean, I know that this is a difficult and awkward discussion inside the Trump circle, this birthday. And it has been, I know of one situation in which this was brought up, how to kind of counter program against this, and also against the background of Biden and how that affected his age and the perception of his age, and the fact that they failed to successfully program against that affected his presidency. So what should they do? And isn't this worthy of a substantial discussion? Well, Trump completely cut that off, cut this person dead. No discussion of this, no wanting to go down that path. And in fact, he now deflects to the 250th birthday of the United States. That's the birthday that counts. That's the birthday they should be thinking about. Anything not to have people thinking about his 80th birthday.
Does he know that people worry about his health? That they worry about his cognitive health, that they worry about his physical health, his cankles, the bruising on his hands, the fact he falls asleep in cabinet meetings and other meetings. He appears to be able to fall. Fake news.
Fake news is just what they're saying, what the Democrats are saying. Fake news. Look at him. Never been better. Couldn't give, what, and then he'll recount how many speeches he's given. And how few speeches Biden gave, and how much he does, and how often he talks to the press, and how and whatever he actually always reverts to his public life, to how much he is in public, as though that proves that he is an indomitable creature, and not a weak guy who has to have a private life.
And what about the fight, the UFC fight, to celebrate America's 250th anniversary? Why did he plump for that?
Well, he's a UFC supporter and has always been, and the UFC has been and the guy, what's his name?
Dana White.
Has been such a major Trump supporter. I mean, part of Trump's career, which we, of the many aspects that we have glossed over, is his as a sports promoter. And in a sense, it's his real life. And if and I once had a discussion with him about what he would have been if he wasn't this, and he reverts to that. I would have been in the sports industry. I'm a good sports promoter. I'm the best sports promoter. When I do this, there's no one like, et cetera, et cetera.
Right, his usual hyperbole. And what do you think? What do you think the next 2.5 years of his presidency will bring, in as much as anyone can predict anything about the most unpredictable character on the landscape.
Well, I've told you that it would not seem unlikely to me that the next 2.5 years will bring death, and his. I mean, not necessarily ours, but that could happen also. But who knows? I mean, it's Donald Trump. The next 2.5 years will be about Donald Trump. That's, I think, the thing that we can safely predict. Whatever he does will be about him. Whatever he does will be about how he wants people to think about him. Whatever he does will be about wanting people to think about him in any way possible, as long as they are thinking about him. But then very likely he might keel over and die.
Happy birthday, Mr. President. Michael, so much fun talking to you. I love talking about those days in the 80s, because when I was in the UK, it was really, New York suddenly became this thing that everybody in London became obsessed by. People in finance were obsessed by it, people in book publishing and media. It just felt like this incredibly exciting, vibrant, big place. And here we are.
Yeah, big place. Money. It was just money. Just people were infected by money. Everybody infected by this new disease.
So we'll be back with a regular episode of Inside Trump's Head, God willing, on Tuesday. Michael, do you want to thank our team?
You mean God willing because you think Trump might die or we might die?
Who knows? I never want to take anything for granted.
Well, let me thank our team, who really, and I can almost get sentimental about this, because they do carry us through this. We have no idea what we're doing, and
125 episodes in, we still don't really know what we're doing, except we just are clamoring around inside Trump's head.
So Ryan, Heather, Rachel, Neil, and John, thank you so much.
So the good news is we have so many B-Beast tier members now. There are too many names to read out, and we really appreciate your support.